what effect great power has upon a person. You know, she's the mother of dragons, and she controls what is in effect the only 3 nuclear weapons in the entire world that I've created. What does it do to you when you control the only 3 nuclear weapons in the world, and you can destroy entire cities or cultures if you choose to? Should you choose to? Should you not choose to? These are the issues that fascinate me.
Well, there you have it, folks. Dragons or nukes, video over, cool thumbnail in the trash. But, are they actually nukes? I mean, sure, George R.R. Martin and many of his fans view them as acceptable stand-ins for nukes, and no doubt they're supposed to fill that role in the story. But, do they actually? And is there anything else that we could more keenly liken dragons to? What about all those times people defeated dragons? What about all those wars? What about Dorne? What about old geese? Well, we're going to cover that, and more, and dragon biology in this weird, bizarre video about why dragons aren't nukes. So strap yourself into your favorite flying murder machine and take wing as we tackle one of the most interesting ideas in the Ice and Fire theory fandom and universe, dragons themselves. So starting off this video, I want to note that I'm not the only one who's tackled this topic. Although it only came to my mind recently as something that might make a fun video, apparently numerous outlets had already covered it. Heck, the idea even appears on the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation website, along with what appears to be a Dukes of Hazzard joke. Little behind the times, Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. So you may be asking, random internet guy, we just heard the old bookie man say they were nukes. What the heck is going on here? Why are you even making this video? And what case could you possibly build against the author that these are not the best representation, or even not a representation, of nuclear weapons? Well, first off, nukes don't really work the way dragons do, and as a matter of basic observation, many people have pointed out, myself included, that dragons are actually much more akin to the devices that carry nuclear payloads, aircraft or missiles or things like that. Dragons just don't match up cleanly with proliferation in general, and they certainly don't match up cleanly with the nuclear weapon as a single device outside of its ability to be delivered to target. What's the dragon equivalent of selling the plans to build a nuclear weapon to another country that has no program capable of launching said nuclear weapon? What's the dragon equivalent of a suitcase bomb? Okay, maybe I'm asking some of the wrong questions. I mean, after all, we could nitpick the one-to-one similarities between dragons and nuclear weapons all day. Let's focus on something slightly different. Does dragon fire operate like a nuclear weapon? And then building off of that, is there anything that dragon fire does operate like? Now, if you've only watched the show, you probably have a very bizarre conceptualization of how dragon fire would work. After all, take a look at these clips. It appears to have highly explosive effects. But there's some gigantically serious problems with this. Now, I'm no physicist, so don't take me with anything more than a grain of salt, but imagine if you personally as a human being had the wind capacity in your lungs to blow over a concrete structure. That would have undesired consequences for your body. Mostly, it would propel your body away from the structure with the same force that you were using to knock the structure down. This is kind of why bombs explode in all directions. I mean, not entirely, there's things like shaped charges and shit like that, but for all intensive purposes, there are laws in physics around how force works. The amount of force being shown here, force capable of completely uprooting and disintegrating brick buildings, would probably be propelling the dragon into orbit in the opposite direction. Okay, random internet guy, you big brain smarty, book nerdy, non-physicist. Well then, how does dragon fire work? Explain it to us. Okay, I will. Have you ever heard of napalm? Now, napalm might not be as popular or common of weapon nowadays, but generally speaking, it was at one point a quite popular weapon that was used consistently in warfare, particularly in the wars that George R.R. Martin was alive during as a teenager or a young man. I'm more specifically referring to Vietnam here, a war that George R.R. Martin has an intimate relationship with, as he was a conscientious objector. So I don't want you to walk away with the impression here that I'm trying to say that a dragon is a napalm bomb. but they certainly appear to drop a napalm-like substance. To explain, fire doesn't continue in perpetuity without some kind of fuel. So what am I driving at here? Why do I think Dragonfire is not simply a flying lighter? Well, if we go beyond the television show, we actually get some much more tangible in-book examples of how Dragonfire functions. And looking outside the world of Ice and Fire, we can also see alternative methods for delivering napalm to target that don't include an actual bomb. For example, a flamethrower. Now, if you've ever seen videos of flamethrowers that are spitting out accelerated gas, you'll notice that they do not have the range of traditional flamethrowers, number one, but also they have much less capability of lighting things on fire. And this is because traditional flamethrowers that deliver a napalm-like substance, or napalm itself, are actually delivering a substance to the target. When the napalm hits a tank or a person or whatever unfortunate thing is in the way, it sticks to it and continues burning off of the fuel source. Have I lost you yet? Basically what I'm saying is it's not just that Dragonfire is extremely hot or propelled at speed from a dragon. Dragonfire is leaving behind a residual substance that continues burning. Now there's something very important here that I don't want to go overlooked. Dragonfire doesn't become on fire until it exits the dragon. What do I mean by this? I mean that the chemical substance the dragon is expelling that will become the flaming napalm equivalent once it hits oxygen, is my guess, is not exposed to that within the dragon itself. That's why the dragon can pump this otherwise burning material through its body. If, for example, Dragonfire materialized as fire within the actual dragon itself, it would have the same burning consequences for the dragon that it would have for whatever the dragon is targeting with its fire. It would cause the dragon to kill itself by virtue of cooking its own internals with its weaponry. And this is why I think it's relatively easy to conclude that Dragonfire becomes flammable, or at least catches fire, once it hits the air. There's some sort of chemical process occurring there that turns the non-flaming substance into a flaming substance. So diving a little deeper, I believe this is somewhat why dragons express different colors through their fire in the same way they express different colors in their skin tones. There's a little bit of each dragon's unique chemical composition in their fire. And this again clues us in that Dragonfire is some kind of liquid chemical cocktail that is created within the dragon, stored safely, and then expelled before it becomes flammable. And seeing as how we're already baked potato deep in the tinfoil here, I'd like to add one other potential element. It's always been interesting to me that dragons need to use fire to cook their food, or prefer to do it. I mean, like, what is that? What's going on there? Well, if the dragon is spitting some chemical cocktail forth, this chemical cocktail may contain not only whatever it needs to ignite once it hits oxygen, but it also may contain some kinds of enzymes that break down the food. These enzymes' process might be accelerated by the heat or the fire itself, essentially pre-digesting the food for the dragon. And this would make a degree of sense. Dragons are large beings that require a high caloric intake to operate efficiently. The less energy they expend digesting their food and the more food they can acquire, the better the overall ratios are going to be. Essentially, the theory would be the less energy the dragon is exerting on digesting its food, the more energy the dragon has to be a dragon. So the chemical cocktail that creates Dragonfire may have a multitude of functions beyond just being a fiery inferno. Now, I know this is very tangential, so let's reel it back into what we were originally talking about, which is how dragons operate. So, random internet guy, are you saying that dragons are like planes that spit napalm? Yes, actually, that's exactly what I'm driving at. Dragons are aircraft. They have an operational range, they require fuel, they require a pilot, they require assisted targeting from said pilot to determine when the dragon dumps its payload of spicy, hot napalm. And much like planes that deliver napalm payloads to target, dragons require fuel. And I'm not just talking about the fuel required to grow the dragon and give it the physical energy and strength it needs to fly. I'm talking about that dragons producing a flammable material substance that's projected by muscle force from inside of them can only produce and expel so much of that substance at once. Dragons, for lack of better terms, have a payload maximum. And that payload maximum is well under the output of a nuclear weapon. And when speaking of dragons, we're not speaking of something, difficult to shoot down, like a fast-flying missile guided to target. Dragons are vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. And as it turns out, anti-aircraft fire is what kills dragons often enough. Also, it seems as though you can kill dragons in their hangar by storming the dragon pit, but, maybe we'll get to that later. Alright, random internet guy, you've made your point. Dragons are tactical air power, or close air support, or whatever you want to call that stuff. But, don't they function politically as nukes? And I thought you said this was going to be a video that included Old Gis. Where the hell is Old Gis in here? Don't worry, we're going to get to Old Gis shortly enough. But first, do dragons operate politically like nuclear weapons? I mean, just being a deterrent or being a weapon isn't the end-all be-all of how nuclear arms function. Nuclear arms generate enormous treaties, huge series of them, that control not only how the weapons can be deployed, but how big they can be, how many of them one can have, and most importantly, what kinds of defenses one is allowed to operate against the threat of nuclear arms. But none of that's there. And for all their formidable firepower, dragons don't have the destructive qualities of a nuclear bomb, nor do they have the long-lasting damage of nuclear fallout. Which brings us back to dragons being napalm-dumping aircraft. And that, my random internet people, is how we arrive at Old Gis. Or Gis. I don't know how to pronounce it. Old Gis. The year was way the fuck back in the day. The place was Essos. And the Harpy was on the rise. Yes, the empire of Old Gis was said to have hit its height 1,000 years before the Valerian freehold would be birthed on the continent. In these days, Gis ruled the known world and exerted military power through the might of its legions. These bronze-clad warriors dominated the continent and were more than a match for any empire or force they came up against. That is, until the rise of Valeria. And this is where things get a bit choppy. There were 5 great wars fought between Giscard and the Valerian freehold, and for most people, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I'm about to do my best to make it make a whole lot less sense than that. Or maybe a whole lot more, depending how much you like the crisp of my tinfoil. It's long been debated whether or not the Valerians actually came from space, be they the Earth ecological engineers, be they Steel Angels, be they Takesians, be they something else, and I'm going to have a video on this in the near future, so we'll get back into this topic. However, whether the Valerians were organically born of Planetos or aliens that came from another place, it is quite clear they didn't always have dragons. So when we think about those 5 wars, we have to think about the fact that, number 1, they didn't always have dragons. Number 2, they didn't always have as many dragons as they did at the height of their power. Number 3, dragons take time to grow. And number 4, the Giscari probably figured out how to combat them. And thus, I think we should not look at these wars as Gis challenging Valeria's might with dragons with its might of legions, but rather the Giscari Wars as an evolving process in which Valerians developed dragons to counter the might of the Legion. Incidentally, this also makes them being geneticists from space a lot more likely, in my opinion, but I digress. Like I said, we'll get back to that in a different video. So here's what I roughly think happened. After initial encounters with Giscard, probably through the First War, or maybe through some previous wars that are not as prominent in the history books, the Valerians developed dragons. They needed some way of overpowering the pseudo-phalangite-style army of Gis, something that they obviously were unable to beat in the field. So this is where things get interesting. Gis survives 5 wars with Valeria. Great wars, they're called. And who knows how much this is chalked up to the Valerians overwriting the history in their favor and making themselves sound cool. But 5 wars against dragons is a lot. How does one even win a single war against dragons? Well, for that, we're going to have to turn to Dorn, and the art of anti-dragon warfare. Dornish anti-dragon warfare can certainly be described as asymmetrical warfare. They basically never meet the Targaryens under conditions the Targaryens set. Ambushing armies that are unsupported by dragons, allowing large armies to simply kill themselves off through attrition alone, the abandoning of certain castles and cities, making the strategic objectives of the Targaryens unfulfillable. I mean, it's kind of hard to hunt down and murder the Dornish lords and force them to surrender if they just simply aren't there when you show up. More or less simply denying any Targaryen ability to engage you on terms that are favorable. Once the Targaryens capture and fill up some of these castles, declare their victory, and then fly away, the Dornish re-emerge, butcher everyone in the castles, and the Targaryens are forced to come back. Eventually, the Targaryens start pursuing a more aggressive policy, and they began burning castles and holdfasts and villages and such. But again, the Dornish are completely expecting and prepared for this, and they begin striking out at the Targaryens, doing the exact same thing to Targaryen-held lands and castles and villages that are undefended by dragon firepower. So with the dragons chasing their tail round and round and round, they begin to kind of work themselves into a routine. That's when the Dornish switch it up. The Targaryens arrive to burn down the Hellholt again, and they find that it's actually full of anti-aircraft batteries. What do I mean? I mean scorpions, ballistae kind of weaponry, and they use these things to kill the dragon. Now after this, the Targaryens do go on a rather ruthless firebombing campaign. However, since the histories are written by the Maesters and written outside of Dorne, I'm skeptical as to how effective this campaign would have been. And judging by the fact that it failed to turn any of the Dornish against the Martells, or really do anything to cripple Dorne further, I'm guessing this is a lot more propagandized and was at the time done as much more of a performative show of force than anything that actually would have had any sort of serious effect on Dorne. I think it's also important to note that around this time, rumors were going around that the Targaryens were refusing to attack Sunspear because the Dornish may have allegedly purchased a device from Lys designed to slay dragons. I don't know what this would be, other than, more ballistae-style weaponry? Maybe some sort of giant slingshot catapult thing? Who knows? But this does clue us into the fact that anti-dragon weapons are at least rumored to exist. And traditional weaponry can be used to kill dragons, so some kind of modified version that was designed specifically to bring down dragons doesn't actually seem that far-fetched. So the Dornish deployment of anti-dragon warfare seems to have severely limited their ability to conduct airstrikes within Dorne. But on top of that, the Dornish began targeting one of the most irreplaceable parts of the Targaryen Air Force: the pilots. And ultimately, it gets to be too much. They cannot withstand these consistent attacks, and they have no recourse to continue to war against Dorne, and the risk of losing dragons only gets worse and worse the more time the Dornish have to dig in and plan. Eventually, the Targaryens are forced to accept terms of peace. So if the Dornish invented anti-dragon warfare to meet their needs in Dorne, why am I bringing it up in relation to Old Geese? Well, I think the piece of information that connects these two very disparate stories is that rumor of anti-dragon weaponry coming from the east, coming from Lys. I think it's relatively rational to assume here that the Dornish, while doing something new in Dorne, were not doing something new in history, and were not doing something new in warfare. I think they were reviving the methodology of Old Geese. Or Geese. Still having trouble with that one. This is why there were so many wars, and this is also why there needed to be so many dragons. They were getting shot down. After all, in the same way that you wouldn't really want dragon proliferation outside your empire, you wouldn't really want dragon proliferation amongst your vassals, amongst the other ruling families, amongst the other powerful Valyrian houses. And yet, that expansion of power did occur. Why? Well, I think the wars that Valyria was conducting abroad had a great deal to do with it. This was the expansion of the Valyrian Air Force program. This was the expansion of the ability to tactically strike targets on the ground from Dragonback. This was creating enough dragons and dragon riders that you could afford to lose some if it came down to it. And I think ultimately at the end of the day this was enough. When only 3 dragons were around to invade and punish Dorne, losing one was a catastrophic loss, one that really probably single-handedly did win the war for the Dornish. And Dorne isn't a massive rival imperial power that might seek to topple your budding empire and kill you and all your dragons. So the need for the Targaryens to replace them with more dragons to conduct future wars wasn't as dire. For old Valeria, however, it may well have been the difference between life and conquest by geese. And though it may have taken much trial and error, and though they may have suffered many losses along the way, ultimately Targaryen heir power, it would appear, did beat old geese. And on that weird and wacky note, I think we'll wrap it up here. The video's getting kind of long, and I'm sure we've rambled about all kinds of weird shit, so it's probably a good time to stop. And so if you have ideas, suggestions, corrections, alternative arguments, now is a great time to throw those in the comments section, and I will do my very best to get back to you. Thank you everyone for watching, and I will see you next time.